So as we start today to look at the second key concept of the second era, which no one wants to, let's not call it era 2, because that's just so boring and nondescript. So we're going to call it the way historians have long referred to this period, certainly the way world historians have long referred to this period, as the classical period. There is no rough beginning of the classical period. Like, we can't say, it is the year 1000 and thus marks the beginning of the classical period. But because that is such a nice round number, historians, and including your author, the author of your textbook, chose the year 1000 to mark the beginning of the classical period. Other historians might push to the year 600 BCE. It's all nebulous. It doesn't really matter. But what does matter is a little bit on the other end. We're going to push to about the year 600 CE. So if you want to think 1000 BCE is a nice round number for a starting point on the front end, and around 600 as an end point on the back end, that is good. This is what we refer to as periodization. Yes, ma'am? BCE to CE, yes. So about 1000 BCE to about 600 CE.
1600 to 600 years?
Yeah, sure. This is what we refer to as periodization. It is a historical construct. It is only put together by historians. Nobody in the year 600 CE was excited because it was the end of the classical era and they were wondering what was going to come next. They couldn't wait to see. These are years that are put together by historians. Oftentimes they fit, especially as we go further back, they fit nice round numbers because that's easier for us to remember. So our first period is or the second period for AP World, but this period that we're dealing with today, classical period, roundabouts 1000 BCE to roundabouts 600 CE. That's important for you to keep in the back of your mind because as we start to fit in a lot of these classical civilizations, or just a lot of civilizations in general over time, it is going to help your memories to compartmentalize these things, to remember the classical Chinese civilizations along with the classical Indian civilizations, along with the classical Mediterranean civilizations, and to put them all in the same box. Even though their years don't perfectly match up, it helps us delineate this period from the next and these civilizations from the next. Yes, sir?
So what was the main change that began this period?
What a wonderful segue bringing us into this. So this is where you were supposed to start your reading. And before I get into the biggest changes, let's actually look at who we're dealing with, okay? So you guys have a generic map, and we have thrown on there some bodies of water, and we've got the continents as we currently know them thrown on here. You do see all of the political lines of all of the countries that exist today, but if we could, in our minds, scrub those out, because of course those lines didn't exist in the classical period. So we are going to, I guess the biggest change that we're going to get in this classical period, what delineates the classical period from what came before, is we're going to take those very early river valley civilizations that you guys talked about at the end of last year, those very early river valley civilizations, whether it be in Mesopotamia or in Egypt or in China around the Wanghe River, in India along the Indus River. We're going to take those early classical civilizations and or pre-classical civilizations, river valley civilizations, and we're going to grow them. They're going to expand far beyond the reaches that the early river valley civilizations ever could have expanded or could have handled. So the biggest change, Alex, is the massive expansion of what were previously relatively small regional states. All right? And can we get into in a moment why we have that massive expansion? And we will talk about first what civilizations the College Board makes sure that you need to know when it comes to our exam. First of all, we're going to throw this word empire out there, or imperial systems. We are all excited about the new Star Wars movie coming out, so I'm sure you guys are familiar with what an empire is. Because of Star Wars, when we hear the word empire, we hear some ominous music in the background and we think of scary things, right? Empires in like the Galactic Empire, that's kind of scary, all right? Ruled by nasty people. But empires in and of themselves aren't necessarily, we've got all different kinds of them. Some are very harsh and brutal. Those tend not to last quite as long. Some are more willing to kind of work with the people around them, and those tend to flourish. We're going to talk about a number of them, but let's get a good definition of what an empire actually is. Can you guys throw out to me some things that you think must exist to make an empire an empire? Yes?
An army?
They probably have an army to keep the peace internally, to keep outsiders out. They probably have an army.
Like an empire, by the definition of it, is like it's not a kingdom because there are different things, but it's like a government that rules over different people.
Okay, yeah, so they rule over people. Let's go Tyler, then we're going to hop here.
An empire is a sovereign nation or a body of territory that is governed by the same kind of elected, not elected, but some kind of people that are the same.
Okay.
Considered the same empire or the same people.
So we've got, and I love that you use that word sovereign. Sovereign. And you notice in the word sovereign, we have the word reign, like to rule over something. So if an empire or a state is, or a nation today is sovereign, what does that mean? Self-ruling and outside, like no one has the right to step in and dictate to a sovereign state. All right? People will do it all the time or attempt to do it, and then that causes problems. But empires are sovereign. Outsiders are out. They get to make their own rules. And then Tyler threw in there's usually some kind of unification of people within that empire, maybe some cultural unification, which we'll talk about how challenging this is, as what did I already mention? What distinguishes the River Valley civilizations from the classical empires? They're going to get much bigger. And what are you going to imagine they're going to do as they're going to get so much bigger? Take over much more land, and when they take over much more land, they're going to take in far more people who might not share the same cultures or backgrounds. So that could be a challenge to an empire. So I would wonder if an empire has to be, homogeneous. Homogeneous? Does it have to have the same kinds of people in it? Or could they be heterogeneous, right? We know that maybe a variety of peoples in it. And we're going to see empires of different sizes and statures that will incorporate maybe different types of people within them. And we're often going to find those that are more homogeneous sometimes have a harder time holding on to their rule. Alex?
That's like what I was getting at, because like one of the key differences between what a kingdom is and what an empire is like an empire is a bunch of not like a bunch of peoples. What I mean by peoples is like different people of a definite ethnic cultures. They're under control by one government, and if they're under control by one government, they don't necessarily have the same beliefs, and it's more possible for like rebellion to happen.
Sure. I wonder by the end of the year if you're going to see as strong of a distinction between a kingdom and an empire, or an emperor and a king. I think we're going to blur those words a lot as we go through the year. I had a comment over here, then we can hop back to Tyler. Yes, ma'am, did you have something you wanted to add into your definition of what an empire is? Okay. Anybody else want to add anything into their definition of an empire? Tyler.
I think a difference between an empire and a kingdom, like to add on to what Alex said, I think it's either this one or that one. I'm not pretty sure, but I think either empire or kingdom has like other smaller states, like a principality that lies within it. That is like the Romans. Call the Roman Empire, but within Roman they allow like local leaders.
Right, and I think what we do have to acknowledge in world history, world historians like to lump things together and try to view how they're similar. Like what similarities are there between the classical Chinese empires and the classical Mediterranean empires like Rome. But they also like to acknowledge that there's going to be a lot of differences as well. So while some empires might rule their entire territory with an iron fist, not allowing for variances of beliefs, other empires might rule like a provincial system, like you're bringing up with Rome, where they might allow different activities in different parts of their empire. So there is, there's no one pure definition or look of empires. But in this class, I hope we're going to be able to find some strong similarities between all the empires we'll talk about, and then some stark differences between them. Yes, ma'am?
I'm not sure if this is correctly if I'm wrong, but in a kingdom, I think like the king is like not really appointed by the people, but like it's chosen, like from like the mandate of heaven and stuff like that.
Certainly in China, yeah. Yeah, so we're going to have some different ways that the emperor or the king could rise to power. I think, I don't want you to go into the year with like a stark difference in what a king is or what an emperor is, because they're not really that different. They're not really that different. Last word on this, Mina, and then I will throw out like more of a textbooky definition for you. I think they often want to expand, and we'll talk about why that's going to be. Well, you guys can probably figure out why that's going to be. Why do empires desire expansion? What comes from expansion? Money. Why? Very good. You bring more people into your empire, that is more people to tax, and that can make you stronger. And when empires are growing, they tend to be stronger. When empires are in decline, when they're literally shrinking, when they're literally losing territory, they're falling apart and they're going to die.
Well, it goes either way because they're minimizing because they're getting weak, and they're getting weak because they're minimizing.
Sure. So we got a little bit of a chicken and an egg kind of thing working together, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I throw out a very textbooky definition? I don't know if you need to write this whole thing down. Just hear it. It is on my notes, of course. A large collection of peoples across a broad geographic range. So we're usually, when we're talking empire, we're talking a pretty sizable geographic entity that live under common rule.
Can you repeat that?
A lot of people, large area, common rule. I think that's how my notes would probably look. Don't write me word for word. Too many words. Large area, common rule, a lot of people. And we are going to see, as we talk about a lot of these empires, we're going to see some common characteristics. So as we go through the next few days, and we hear about classical China and classical India and the classical Mediterranean, we're going to kind of notice that there are some similarities. We often see trade routes being established by these empires, going over long distances. We often see taxes levied on subject people.
Tax collectors.
Yes. We often see an enforced religion. Not always, often. The Sith are the only people that are allowed to speak in absolutes. They're not now. There's 2 Star Wars references. I am really pushing my nerd credibility here. In AP World History, we do not speak in absolutes. All right? Just because something might be true for many or most empires does not necessarily mean it's true for all. Just because something might be true for many individuals does not necessarily mean it's true for all. One of the most basic tips that you guys are going to get as we get into actually looking at what AP exam questions look like, and you guys remember this maybe from APUSH, is that if you have one of those responses, one of those 4 answers that says something like, all people in this community did this, probably avoid it. I'm not going to say always avoid it, because that would be an absolute and I would be a hypocrite. But probably avoid that one. If you're going to avoid one, that's probably the one to do. Avoid the absolutes. So we've got often an enforced religion. These empires, especially as they encompass a pretty large geographic region, often deal with threats from outside. Whether it be from neighboring empires, or maybe outside, such a harsh word, but let's call them barbarian groups. Outsiders, maybe nomadic peoples that aren't a part of a set established civilization. Why are nomadic peoples not a part of any kind of sedentary civilization? Yes, ma'am?
Nomadic people move around.
They move. And like, civilizations are based on a lot of things like agriculture and monumental architecture that you can't put on your back or even put on your horse's back and take it with you. So nomadic peoples don't establish. But nomadic peoples often like a lot of the stuff that settled civilizations have, right? They might like their weapons. They might like some of the foodstuffs that they have. They might like some of the people that they have, in particular, maybe women. So oftentimes you would see raids from nomadic civilizations going into settled civilizations where they might wreak some havoc. So you've got a lot of these settled civilizations and empires that deal with nomadic peoples from the outside who are often pretty tough and are often really good at riding horses and shooting bows and arrows. So they can cause some serious problems for people. We're going to talk a lot about the Mongols as we get in later in the year to give a good example of this. So they've often got problems from outside. This word barbarian, anyone know the derivation of that? It's not a region. It comes from the Greeks, yes?
Because they said that they'd always speak like barbarians.
Because to a Greek, and really to anybody, when we hear a foreign language, especially if someone's speaking fluently in their language, it sounds like gibberish if you have no understanding of that language. So to the Greeks, these outsiders, it just sounded like babbling, like bar, 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 bar. They couldn't understand it, so bar, 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 bar turned into barbarians. And now that's a word we still use for like outsiders, often that we don't understand. We don't think they're as civilized as us. They're outsiders.
It's so funny because I used to get confused between the term barbarian and the word Babylonian.
Interesting. There is no connection, but they're similar words. Okay. So we've got enforced religion, threats from outside, a system of centralized governments. A system of centralized governments. And this is like a really important concept that I think you guys already know and understand, but I want to throw it out there to make sure we get this. Why did we as human beings establish centralized rule, establish governments? Why do we establish governments? Yes?
So people can be enforce more rules and everything, so it's more civilized society.
To have a more civilized society? Okay, why do we desire a more civilized society? I'm still asking you.
Oh, it's more efficient.
Okay, we want more efficiency, we want more civilization. Yes, why?
Wasn't it like if you had like no ruler, like no power, then like a lot of people fight over it?
People are going to be fighting, and when people are fighting, people get hurt, or people might lose their stuff. I don't want to lose my stuff. I work hard for my stuff. So I appreciate that we have a government that establishes laws that will punish people that try to take my stuff. And in fact, those very punishments that we've established keep most people from even considering taking my stuff, right? Yes, sir?
Having a common ruler or a centralized government or of some sort creates an entity that everybody within that community would adhere to, like a set of laws, so everybody live within the same set of rules.
Everybody knows what to expect. Everybody knows how to act, sure. But from its very beginning, and we don't have governments like this in the sense that we think of a government today, until we had settled civilizations, until those river valley civilizations, right? And what did people start to acquire once the river valley civilizations came to be? We had land that we grew food on, and we would sell that food, and there would be money or stuff that we would collect, right? And we would want to protect that stuff. So oftentimes, we would rely on some kind of central authority that might have had a little muscle, or at least some soldiers, to protect us. Because there's all these outside barbarians that might want to come in and take our stuff. So I might be willing to give a little bit of my wealth in the form of tax dollars of some sort, or taxes of some sort, in order to get that protection back. All right? I'm willing to give a little bit to protect my stuff. Also, these governments are going to be very important, especially with the advent of agriculture, because modern agriculture, or at least like the earliest agriculture, which was modern at the time, you needed to like irrigate lands, right? You needed to get water from that river to your farms. And oftentimes those were really big jobs. I couldn't do it on my own. So we would need some central organization to organize the labor, to get these big jobs done. So protect our stuff, get big jobs done that need to be done in more modern societies. We establish governments, all right? If governments aren't protecting our stuff, Thomas Jefferson talked about this, right? If governments aren't protecting our stuff, what has 5,000 years of human history told us we do?
Revolt.
We revolt. We get rid of it and try to set something new up that might protect our stuff. Sometimes we do a good job. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we end up in kind of chaos, right? The classical period of world history, though, creates larger empires than mankind had ever seen before, with a more efficient way to protect everybody's stuff than mankind had ever seen before. And we call this centralization, all right? We call this centralization. As you go from maybe having local rulers or local leaders, maybe called landlords, local folks that controlled a lot of land and would look out for their little local plot of land, to the evolution of maybe a central emperor or king or really powerful landlord that will have many landlords paying him taxes, and he will oversee the protection of much of it.
So you're
So-
saying centralization was like,
Centralization is taking all of the maybe local leaders and local rulers that might have existed and bringing them into one central entity, forcing them, one way or another, to follow a central set of rules, a central set of ideas. And that's what we see in this classical period, right?
so uniting all local leaders under one authority.
That's centralization. Very good. So let's look at our maps really quick, and I'm going to have you guys jot a couple things down. The College Board requires you to know a handful of classical civilizations, and not only where they are, but when roughly they were ruled. Now, I would never expect any of my students to remember these specific years, all right? The good news is, if you know the rough parameters of the classical period, round about 1000 BC to round about 600 CE, you could at least throw a dart into the rough years that these civilizations existed, right? Like, if you knew the classical period, and I gave you I said, the Persian empires. When were the Persian empires thriving? Pick a year roundabouts the middle of the classical period, and you're right. All right? So I'm not going to require you or ever think that you're going to memorize the specific years of all of these beginnings and endings. But you know roughly when they're going to be. First, Southwest Asia. What? We've never even heard the phrase Southwest Asia. That's not something we use, but it is something the College Board uses. So we've got to know Southwest Asia. Here's Asia. Here's South. Here is Southwest Asia. It's what most people here, or today, call the Middle East.
Yeah.
Why do you think the College Board uses the word Southwest Asia rather than the Middle East? Yes? No, it's still pretty common right now. Good guess. Yeah, Natalie? I mean, yeah, there's a lot of rough news that's come out lately, but I don't think that's why they've changed it. Mina in the back.
Because Southwest Asia is the actual location.
Yes! Very good. And the Middle East is what?
It's kind of like what we call that.
The Middle East is what we would call like a relative location. The Middle East is only the Middle East if you are like in Western Europe, right? Because the East, the Far East, as the Western Europeans would call it, is East Asia. So the Middle East is like halfway to East Asia. But if you are living in India, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to call the Middle East because it's to the west of you. And as the College Board and as AP World and as world historians like to look at the whole picture of the world and not always just see it as Europe and everything else, in this class, we'll probably hear me saying Middle East, but we also need to think of this as Southwest Asia, not just the Middle East. So we've got the Persian empires of Southwest Asia, the Persian empires. And we will talk a little bit more about the Persian empires at a later date. I've got a couple names of like dynasties of the Persian empires that you should be familiar with. And they are really tough when you guys do your AP World History Spelling Bee. The Achaemenid Dynasty. And I want to make sure I spell it right. No, I made that up. You want to do it? That could be a lot of fun. Maybe we'll try that one day. The Achaemenid Dynasty. The Parthian, that's easier. And these are based on just different ruling families. And the Sassanids. Yeah, ID. Menid. Menid. Yep, my bad. This is an I. So the Achaemenid Dynasty, the Parthians, and the Sassanids. Do you remember last week we talked about the Babylonian captivity that was ultimately ended when the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonians, were conquered by the Persians? And we talked about Cyrus the Great? Yeah. Cyrus was an Achaemenid. So that kind of links that to us.
Spell Cyrus.
C-Y. C-Y. But we will talk more about the Persians at a later date. Their rough time of rule was about 550 BCE to about 661 CE. Yeah, like one, then the other, then the other. Roughly 550 BCE to 661 CE. And I want you, on your map, to put some kind of circle in here so you can see where the Persian Empire is. I'm going to give you a better look at it. But we are talking in what is today Iran and what is today Iraq and Turkey. That was all a part of the Persian Empire at its height. Taking its name from a small region just to the north of the Persian Gulf called Persia. So the whole thing, just like the whole Roman Empire was called the Roman Empire because of the little city of Rome at its heart, this whole thing was the Persian Empire because at the heart is Persia. Yes, ma'am? The Persian Empire and Southwest Asia? The Persian Empire is Southwest Asia. Yeah. Like, the Persian Empire is located within Southwest Asia. Okay, gotcha. All right, next, in East Asia, we are going to look at classical China and two civilizations or two dynasties within classical China. The Qin, which is spelled Q-I-N, and the Han, H-A-N. I will avoid the third Star Wars reference right now. Yes?
The Han had Vietnam for like 500 years.
There you go. So the Qin and the Han dynasties. Let me give you some years. We actually know these years a little bit better. 221 BCE to 220 CE. 221 BCE to 220 CE.
Is that like total?
Yep. That's just the Qin dynasty and the Han dynasty. There's other dynasties. We're going to mention them to you just so you hear them. But those are the classical ones that we need to really know well. That's what we call East Asia. And you guys can find it on your big map. So maybe on your map in East Asia, you throw a little bit of circle around where China is. So you know that that's where the Han and the Qin dynasties were. We're going to talk about South Asia. South Asia is what the College Board calls and what most world historians call the Indian subcontinent. This big peninsula that hangs down into the Indian Ocean. This is the Indian subcontinent. This is what world historians call South Asia. Calling it South Asia is really important because you might have a question, like a compare and contrast question that tells you to pick a civilization from Southwest Asia and South Asia. And you better pick maybe Persians and the Mauryaans, for example. I'm going to give you those two names. We've got the Mauryan dynasty. The Mauryans, and later the Gupta. The Mauryans and the Gupta of South Asia. And let me give you a rough window of years. 321 BCE to 550 CE. Now, as we know already, This story in India is a little bit shakier. There's actually a handful of other dynasties that exist between Mauryans and Guptas. Because guess what? When it comes to centralization, do you think South Asia is made for having a strong centralized society? No. Why? One reason why? Well, there'll be other reasons why. Yes, ma'am? A polytheistic Hinduistic faith does not encourage strong centralization. Yes, ma'am?
Maybe like farming, maybe people want to.
No, they were. How do you know they were able to farm well? Because they were there.
Oh.
Because they were big. Because they made it into the history book. Societies that don't figure out how to farm well don't make it into the history book. They die out or get conquered by others that teach them how to farm.
Really?
Yes. All right. We will also be talking about the classical Mediterranean. We know where the Mediterranean Sea is, right? In fact, do you know what the word Mediterranean means?
Middle.
Of? Lands. Medi is middle, and the Terranean part is earth, like a terrarium, right? Where you keep your turtle. It's like a little model of earth that you keep. What's his name again? I don't have, that's a weird name for a turtle. But anyway, so Mediterranean is the sea between the lands. So it's between Europe and Africa. And we're going to talk about a few different states here. We've got Phoenician states, or cities. The Phoenicians. You've probably heard of them before. We appreciate them because they gave us our alphabet.
Oh, is that like phonetic?
Mm-hmm. The Phoenicians, we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about the Greek city-states.
So Greek was not even an empire.
It is going to be for a little bit. We'll talk about that too. We're going to talk about the Greek Empire called the Hellenistic Empire. Thanks to one Greek guy named Alexander. So the Hellenistic period of Greek history. And then we'll, of course, talk about the Roman Empire. Naturally, all of these specific empires and states have their own years of thriving. But let's give you a window of years for the classical Greek world. Roughly 1200 BCE to go back to the high point of the Phoenicians. 1200 BCE to go all the way back to the high point of the Phoenicians. To a year that you'll probably want to remember just so you can sound smart. 476, the year that Rome finally fell for the last time. CE. 476 CE.
Yeah, Rome definitely did not take place.
The Roman Empire? Or
Yep.
the Rome?
The city of Rome. The Roman Empire would continue, but not based on Rome anymore. So, roughly the dates we give for the... It's kind of crazy because they moved. They set up a new capital. We'll talk about all this year. So much to learn this year. Now, this is where a lot of like old world history classes kind of stopped. Today, the College Board has us hop across the Atlantic Ocean. This is a very zoomed in picture of Mexico with the Yucatan Peninsula being up here. And we're going to talk about a Mesoamerican civilization. Mesoamerica? Meso?
Middle America.
Middle America. Mesoamerica is what we consider Central America, Mexico and the Central American countries. And we're going to give some brief mention to a classical civilization in Mesoamerica based on a city called Teotihuacan.
What the heck? What is that?
Don't remember that for the spelling bee.
Teotihuacan.
That's not Tenochtitlan.
That is not Tenochtitlan. That's going to come later. Teotihuacan. It's right here. There we go.
So that's
And later, we're going to add in some discussion about some Mayan city-states. You guys have heard of the Mayans, right? They were the earliest. You guys probably are a little bit familiar with the Mayans and the Aztecs. And in South America, the Incas. You've probably heard of these guys. The Mayans are earlier. So Teotihuacan and the Mayan city-states, around about 150 BCE, all the way up to, for Teotihuacan, about 600 CE. And then the Mayan city-states would thrive up to about 900 CE. And one other little corner of the globe to mention. Andean South America. The Andes Mountains here. Within the Andes Mountains, we're going to have some early civilizations. One that you should be familiar with is called the Moche people, M-O-C-H-E. And later, the Incans, much later, the Incans, about 1,000 years after these guys, the Incans will come and thrive in the Andes. But the Moche are earliest. M-O-C-H-E, about 100 CE to 750 CE. Andean South America. Andean South, like in the Andes Mountains, along the coast.
Wait, what societies are there?
Moche, M-O-C-H-E.
And their year was 150.
About 100 CE to 750 CE. So these are the classical civilizations that you must be aware of. They are all on your standards. They will be possibly asked of you on the AP exam. Yes, ma'am.
Wait, what were the years?
100 to 750. I will not, please do not study and memorize all of those windows of years. That would be mental. I don't expect that. No one does that. In fact, where can you find those years if you need to know it? Probably in your pocket, right? So look on your phone if you want to find the years. Guess what I did as I was putting together my notes? I went on Wikipedia and I found a bunch of years, all right, and threw them on there so I could look smart in front of you. No one remembers all of these. I kind of remember the classical Chinese ones. I kind of remember the fall of Rome. Those are years you might remember. But the rest, just know the rough windows that we're talking about. And what's the rough window? The classical period of history, 1000 BCE to roughly 600. Yeah? No. We're just talking specifically here. I could show you this picture if you'd prefer. Or no, never mind, I don't have it. That's it. All right. So what makes this classical period a little bit different from previous? Far larger civilizations. And a couple things that we can point to as to reason, or maybe one thing in particular as a reason why civilizations of the classical period are going to be allowed to grow so much bigger. We've got a pretty massive technological advancement around about 1500 BCE. Anybody? Yes. Iron working technology. Very good. We start working with iron. We start making iron tools. We start making iron weapons. That allows us to kill people more efficiently, and that allows us to work the land more efficiently. 1500 BCE. So as civilizations start mastering iron, you're going to find a couple things. One, they can produce more food than they've ever produced. More food in human history means more people in human history. As your society is producing more food, you can sustain more of a population. More food also means, and this is going to bring up a word you talked about last year, more food means more specialization. You guys remember that word from last year?
No.
Specialization is the idea that we can now have people in our society doing things besides getting food. In the old hunter-gatherer societies, everybody had to be gearing their lives to acquiring food. And so we couldn't have specialized jobs like soldiers or scribes or priests or things like that. But as we have an agricultural society, and certainly as those agricultural societies grow, we can have more and more specialization to the point of our American society today, where hardly any of us work towards bringing in the food that we consume, and most of us do some kind of specialized job. In fact, the one thing that many people do grow these days, grass, they hire someone else to cut it for them, to take care of it for them. You cut your own lawn? Very good for you. I cut my own too. But I got some neighbors that have people do it. Also, we are going to see, once this iron, because iron working or iron mining is a very laborious job, right? It takes a lot of work, right? You might have to have someone organize the labor for that. Who does a pretty effective job of organizing labor systems? Usually a government, usually a centralized state. So who is probably going to have control of this iron with which to make things like tools and weapons out of? Probably a centralized government. So who is going to be able to furnish weapons to a military? Probably a centralized government. So we're going to create a system where there are those that have the weapons and those that don't. All right? Despite these changes, we're going to have some major continuities that still exist from previous times. Outside of the iron technology, there's not really going to be many other major technological advances. If you look at somebody in the year 1500 BCE or 1000 BCE, they won't look all that different to you from somebody in the year 2000 BCE. Compared to, like, look at someone today compared to 1,000 years ago. We are almost completely different human beings, all right? Certainly way taller than we used to be. Patriarchal systems are going to continue. Patriarchal systems continue. Agricultural society creates patriarchal systems. Those are going to last for as long as we're agricultural societies. But guess what? Today, we're not really an agricultural society anymore, are we? Because we're so specialized. And we're far less patriarchal than we used to be. And every classical civilization is still building upon the things that were begun in the earlier civilizations. So we've got some like religious continuities that are going to exist, some cultural continuities that are going to exist, some architectural continuities that are going to exist. So they're not completely wiping the slate clean from what happened before. Everybody good? Cool.